Whether or not you believe in God, suffering and evil still remain a part of our everyday existence.
Bone cancer in children? How dare you?
You know, suffering and evil will still be there even if we reject God's existence. We haven't eliminated the problem of pain by simply eliminating God. In fact, in some ways, I think it makes the problem of pain worse, because without God, suffering is no longer a mystery, it's simply meaningless. So the question of why a good, all-powerful God would allow suffering and evil in the world is probably one of the oldest questions that exists. And it's the question at the heart of the book of Job, which is actually arguably the Bible's oldest book. So this question goes back a long way. And I'm pretty sure that nobody in history has ever fully answered it. And I certainly don't claim that I will be able to do that today. But I do hope to give some reasons, some kind of encouragement to think about how we might address these big questions, because it's a question we're all going to confront at some point in our life, not just as an intellectual question, as Lucy said, but as a very real, guttural, heartfelt question when we encounter pain, if we're in the midst of suffering ourselves. I remember in 2015, the question of God and suffering was raised very publicly, actually, by the TV personality Stephen Fry. A picture of him in this interview on screen. Now, Stephen Fry is an atheist, but when he was asked by his interviewer what he might say to God if he did meet him, Stephen Fry responded, "I would say, how dare you?" And he went on to list lots of things about our world, disease, pain, the suffering of innocent children, that he would accuse God of being responsible for. Now, I'll be honest, this is a really tough watch if you go and watch this video. Stephen Fry does not mince his words, and he ends his answer by explaining that he could never worship, in his words, an evil, capricious, monstrous maniac of a God.
Suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in on
No,
that?
but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac. Utter maniac. Totally selfish. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him? What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable.
That interview went viral around the world, lots of people sharing it on social media, and it does raise huge questions. And towards the end of this sermon, I want to show you a video that I actually made in response to Stephen Fry about 9 years ago when this video went viral. But in many ways, Stephen Fry's viral interview is just a more recent version of the same question being raised throughout the book of Job. And the good news for you and for me and for Stephen Fry is the Bible has never been afraid of asking these questions. It's never been afraid of asking hard questions about God. We get them in the book of Job. We get them throughout the Psalms. We even get them on the lips of Jesus on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And the question is there an answer to this why question? This week and next, as Lucy said, I'll be up here trying to offer some thoughts on this question. This week, I'm tackling the question of why there is suffering and evil in the first place in the world and whether God is to be blamed for it. And next week, I'll be tackling the question of, given that we do live in such a world, how can God's love and goodness and purposes still be manifest in the world. Now, something I want to say again at the outset is that the answers I'll be offering here are to some extent intellectual and theological answers to this question. But actually, in most situations where people are actually in the midst of suffering, they don't need our philosophical and theological answers. They need us just to weep with them and sit with them and be with them. I've spent a lot of my life engaging with these big intellectual questions, and there is a place for that. But it's actually Lucy, the minister of this church, who's the one who does the really important work of sitting with people in their grief and walking with them through suffering. And actually, that's something each and every one of us is called to do when we're in that position. But at some point, people do often look for intellectual answers to these kinds of questions. And we're going to do that this morning, again, acknowledging that an intellectual response is always going to be limited to some extent. But the why question isn't limited actually to the Bible and the book of Job. In fact, many other religious traditions have offered their own response to this question. But the response we find in Job is actually very different to most other responses in other religious traditions. Because in most religious traditions, if you suffer evil or misfortune or illness and so on, it's often been understood as a punishment from God for our sins, either in this life or even in a previous life. So in Eastern traditions that believe in reincarnation, for example, the concept of karma sees humans as being part of a cycle, and that the difficulties of the life we're experiencing now are somehow connected to our bad behavior in a previous life. And even in many traditions that don't invoke reincarnation, you'll also find this idea very often that our suffering is a result of our own sin. Now, at one level, of course, the Bible affirms that there are things we do that cause our own suffering. That's just part of life. But that's not actually the answer, interestingly, that the book of Job gives. Because the book of Job is very explicit that Job's suffering is not being inflicted upon him by God as a punishment. In fact, it's not being inflicted by God in the first place. We heard last week about how a large part of the book of Job, which tells this story of a good and prosperous man who suddenly loses everything and suffers all kinds of personal misfortune and illness, and how he's visited by several friends, his so-called comforters, and they all try to offer explanations for why he's going through this ordeal. And many of them do stick to that well-known religious answer. God must be punishing you, Job. But it turns out that those are bad, unhelpful answers. And in fact, they just end up making Job more miserable. In our reading, he says to his so-called comforters, "How long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words?" Basically, you aren't helping, guys, okay? In fact, it's very clear from the beginning of the story and throughout Job's answers that he hasn't done anything to deserve this misfortune. So from the outset, we need to understand the book of Job is offering a very different answer to those traditional religious views that God is punishing people when bad things happen. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that Job has landed on the correct answer either, because he goes on in that passage we read to accuse God himself of being against him, saying, "He breaks me down on every side and I'm gone. He's uprooted my hope like a tree. He's kindled his wrath against me and counts me as his adversary." So Job's answer isn't that God is just punishing him for something he's done, but that God just seems to be arbitrarily sort of tormenting him. Now, both Job and his comforters are essentially off beam with their answers, and ultimately it's only God who can answer this question. We have to wait to the end of the book of Job to hear what God himself has to say. But I think it's also really important to see that Job's anguish and his accusations against God, they're not necessarily sinful, because it's a completely normal part of human grief. That raging, that weeping, that accusing God even, because God can handle it. Sometimes that's actually what prayer is. It's just pouring out your feelings, however raw and unvarnished and misplaced they may be. No, I think even that video of Stephen Fry and his diatribe against God, I think that's actually the beginning of a prayer. But of course, the fundamental question still remains, well, why does God then allow suffering and evil in the world? If he has the power to stop it, why doesn't he? In the end, is God to blame, as both Job and Stephen Fry suggest? Well, spoiler, I don't believe God is to blame. I don't believe God causes suffering and evil. So the question is, what is the cause? And I want to offer a few ways of thinking about this question this morning. The first way in which I want to talk about what the cause of evil and suffering is the question of free will. One of the greatest things God has given us as humans is free will. Free will is the freedom that you and I have to make decisions for ourselves, from choosing what we have for breakfast in the morning, Weetabix or cornflakes, to deciding which political party we'll vote for in an election. It's a fundamental thing, freedom, to be human. In fact, free will also means we have the ability to choose to love or not to love other people. By the same token, that means that same freedom gives us the ability to choose good or to choose evil. And the problem, of course, is that many people choose evil rather than good. And it's been that way since page 1 of the Bible. The very opening story of Genesis is about Adam and Eve disobeying God, using their free will to rebel and turn against him when they taste the fruit of that forbidden tree. And that's just a picture of what happens when we misuse our free will and turn against God. So the natural next question is, well, why doesn't God just step in every time we're about to do something wrong? If we've got this free will, he could just step in and stop us from doing it, right? Well, imagine if God did intervene every time someone was going to make a wrong choice. Where would that leave us? If there was no suffering in the world because God just prevented it all by wading in, waving a magic wand every time we made a bad choice, I think actually we wouldn't be free, we'd be puppets. We'd be controlled effectively by a puppeteer who just overrules all of our thoughts and actions at every moment. And that actually, I think, would be worse, in my view, than a world where people freely choose. And yes, sometimes they choose wrongly, because that's a world where love cannot exist, because love has to be given freely and received freely. Free will, in that sense, is a great good that God has given us, but it comes at a cost, because it comes with a great responsibility and the cost of when we misuse it. So people are often quick to blame God, but what if God is not actually to blame for a great deal of the suffering in the world? When I look around at our world, at much of the pain and suffering, I look at the war in Gaza, corruption in government, abuse of the vulnerable, and so on. The vast majority of it is humans misusing their God-given freedom. So would we rather be robots with no choice whatsoever? I don't think so. Because I think part of the grace of God is giving us a choice to become the kind of people we're meant to be. By choosing the good, choosing to love, choosing the way of peace and forgiveness and generosity. And we'll come back to those things actually next week. But for now, it's just important to recognize that actually God isn't to blame for much of the suffering in the world. You and I are. Now, this free will answer to suffering doesn't actually answer the question about all kinds of evil and suffering. What about the kind of suffering that doesn't seem to be so connected with our own personal choices? In recent weeks, we've seen those devastating images of 2 hurricanes in Florida, Hurricane Milton and Helene. These are natural disasters that wreak all kinds of ruin on people. Now, you might term this natural evil. Rather than the things we choose, these are things that just seem to happen in the world. Things like earthquakes and disease and freak accidents. And the question again is, well, is God to blame in these cases? This natural evil. What's the cause of natural evil? Well, again, I don't want us to dismiss free will too quickly here. You may remember several years ago the earthquake in Haiti that caused so much death and suffering. But what's remarkable about that earthquake that took place in Haiti is that it was no more violent as an earthquake than many of the earthquakes that hit other parts of the world, like Los Angeles, for instance, in America, but which do very little damage there. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that by and large, the USA has far more resources and infrastructure to cope with earthquakes. They've built earthquake-proof buildings, they have medical emergency services, they have quick responders, and so on. And that's because America is a rich and prosperous country compared to Haiti. And so the question is, well, there's still a free will element here because it's our choices as humans that have created this world of haves and have-nots, so that when disaster does strike, there are very different outcomes very often in different parts of the world. Ultimately, it still comes down to our human free will and our wrong choices that have led to this kind of a world. And we're even seeing how some of these extreme weather events are linked back to the way we treat the planet. So human free will still actually has a lot to answer for, even in the case of natural evil. Even so, though, I would say that the world we live in simply is a world in which natural laws operate. So think of the tectonic plates that sort of cover the Earth. And when tectonic plate activity happens, that's important actually for renewing the surface of the Earth with the minerals that we need for life. But obviously, when people build on the fault lines of those tectonic plates, it can wreak havoc when they move. Equally, look at cell division and mutation. That's part of the story of how life has developed on Earth. And yet the flip side of that is that it can result in cancer when it goes wrong. And I just want to point these examples out to point out that we live in a tension in our world. And that tension is described in that passage we heard from Romans 8. I'll just read again some of the passage. It says, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies." I love that phrase that Paul uses there. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. It's such a powerful image, this sense that the world is not as it should be, and it's trying to give birth to a new world. But somehow, right now, the whole of the created order is groaning. It's out of kilter. But there's also this promise in Romans 8. The creation will one day be set free from its bondage to decay and will share the glorious freedom of the children of God. Even our own bodies that are so broken and let us down so often, they're going to be redeemed in that final day. And this is the reality of our faith, that we live in the tension of a world that's so full of wonder and beauty and yet also prone to this chaos and this natural evil. We live in that sense in a world of beauty and brokenness, both together at the same time. And we're waiting for the day, the promise we're made in that passage, that one day God is going to set it all right, but we're not there yet. That day hasn't yet come, but we've been given a vision of it. If you go to the end of the book of Revelation, a universe, a world that's been renewed, restored, and recreated, where death has no part in it, where every tear is wiped away, and the glory of God will be all in all. But for now, we live in that in-between time, the tension of the kingdom that's already come in Jesus and the kingdom that has not yet been fulfilled. But what's important about this is it means that God is not willing or causing this natural evil that we see infecting our world. He's actually in the business of redeeming the world through it. And even in the book of Job, as I said, we see that it's not God actually who's causing Job's afflictions. It's the Satan who goes to work on Job. But again, that's a picture of what happens in our world. The dark principalities and powers of our world are in opposition to God. And it's put the whole world out of kilter, and that's why we see these natural disasters. But I think what that tells us is that we're actually living in the middle of a spiritual war zone. There are forces of darkness in our world at war with the good purposes of God. So when we pray in the name of Jesus and when we act and go out into the world in his name, we're actually joining with Christ in reclaiming every corner of creation for God. As we heard earlier, when we recite the Lord's Prayer every Sunday, we pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." And as Lucy said, that means actually God's will isn't being done on earth as in heaven yet. But we're part of the vanguard, if you like. We're part of the movement Jesus has begun the work by conquering death and sin through his cross and resurrection. But there are still plenty of battles to be fought, if you like. The war was decisively turned through Jesus' death and resurrection, but there are still lots of battles, lots of skirmishes going on, and there are always casualties in every war. There's pain, there's grief, there's sadness along the way until that final day of victory. But we don't do it alone. We do it with the hope that God is with us in the battle. We're joining in Jesus' work of bringing his kingdom on earth as we go out in his name. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about how God can actually work through even pain and suffering and how we find God in the midst of all that. And I'll be talking about that next week. But today I wanted just to sketch out these few explanations for why God has allowed evil and suffering to exist in our world. Firstly, because of our own free will. Secondly, because of that natural evil, that world that has been put out of kilter. This spiritual war zone that we live in now, but where God invites us to join him in bringing his kingdom to earth. And we're going to continue to explore the why question next week. The problem is, I don't know if these answers I've offered this morning will satisfy an atheist like Stephen Fry or anyone else, to be honest, because in the end, evil and suffering remain a huge mystery. And it's very difficult to just give a theological or intellectual answer and expect people to either understand or to accept it. But in the end, I do know this. Whether or not you believe in God, suffering and evil still remain a part of our everyday existence. Suffering and evil will still be there even if we reject God's existence. We haven't eliminated the problem of pain by simply eliminating God. In fact, in some ways, I think it makes the problem of pain worse, because without God, suffering is no longer a mystery, it's simply meaningless. If there's no God, if there's no purpose to life, if there's no meaning behind any of the pain and suffering we go through, then there's simply no rhyme or reason to any of it. And personally, I'd much rather walk with Jesus in the mystery of suffering than to walk alone in a world where it's simply meaningless. And I think even Job sees that. I don't know if you saw that at the end of the passage we read. In the midst of his agony, he has this prophetic moment. It just leaps out from the passage that we heard. He's been describing in all this detail his sorrow and his frustration and his confusion, and suddenly he says this, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold, and not another." Some of you might recognize those words from Handel's Messiah. I know that my Redeemer liveth. This is just an extraordinary moment in this long passage from Job, where suddenly Job has this amazing moment and he prophesies Jesus, the Redeemer, who lives despite death and who stands upon the earth, God in human form. And even though our bodies will decay, we shall see him in our flesh, made new, made whole, because he's on our side. It's a promise of hope in Jesus, the one with whom we walk through this mystery of suffering now. And in the mystery of suffering and pain, there is this hope in Jesus that we are all called to hold on to. So I promised to end by showing you my own video response to that viral Stephen Fry video. And when I saw it doing the rounds several years ago, I wanted to find some common ground with him. And I realized that we do actually share at least one thing in common, and that's a love of Oscar Wilde. So I went out to a street in London with a video crew and filmed this personal response for Stephen Fry.
Dear Stephen, I, along with many others, have watched the video in which you explained what you would say to God if you met him. And you explained how, because of a world in which we live of suffering and injustice, you'd have to tell that God that he's a mean, stupid maniac of a God. Now, I'm a Christian, and my first reaction to that was to want to tell you, look, I'll give you 5 bulletproof reasons for why that's not the way God is. But then I kind of realized actually you're not really giving an argument against God, more an expression of your anger that the world is the way it is if a God is in charge of it. And so rather than give you some kind of a philosophical rebuttal, I thought I'd tell you a story. Now, we probably don't have that much in common, but one thing we probably do share is a mutual love of the literary genius of this man, Oscar Wilde. That's why we're filming here today on a cold winter's day at his memorial in central London. Now, I know that you share a deep connection with Oscar Wilde, but I have something in common with him too, and that is that he believed in the same God that I believe in. I've just been reading recently to my kids Oscar Wilde's stories for children. They're absolutely brilliant, and actually I think they're for adults as well. My favourite definitely is the story of the selfish giant. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I think Oscar Wilde in this story expresses actually the true nature of God. The story centres on a garden. It's a garden where it's always winter and never spring. Children used to play there, but they don't play there anymore. And it's all because of the giant's selfishness that has brought this down on this beautiful garden. Interestingly, the Christian story also begins with a garden. And however you interpret that story, fundamentally, it's about the idea that from the beginning, the world has gone wrong because of us. And in many ways, that's bent the whole world out of shape. So in a sense, we're living in the winter garden that Oscar Wilde describes. But in the story, after many years of it being winter and never spring in his garden, the giant sees a child at the end of the garden underneath a tree. And he has a change of heart, and he goes out and he lifts that child into the tree, and suddenly the tree blossoms, and suddenly winter is over, spring has arrived, the children come back, and even the giant's own heart is thawed because of it. But the child he so loves never reappears until the giant grows quite old, actually. And then, while it's winter again, and Wilde adds here, he didn't hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep and that the flowers were resting. Well, he sees that child again at the end of the garden, underneath the same tree, but this time the tree is laden with gold and silver fruit. Well, Wilde takes up the story. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy, and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child, and when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who hath dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hands were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me, that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," answered the child, "but these are the wounds of love." Oscar Wilde didn't believe that God was a tyrant who was basically out to make an evil world. Rather, in a world that's bent out of shape, where winter reigns and the blossoms are few and far between, he spoke of a God who comes into our world, into our darkness, and bears it with us. He talks about a cross and nails, nail prints in his hands and feet, and that these are the wounds of love. These are the defining characteristics of the God that he believes in. "Who art thou?" said the giant, and a strange awe fell on him, and he knelt before the little child. And the child smiled on the giant and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children ran in that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms. Now, I'm not saying that this gives a definitive answer to the problem of suffering and God. I think there are good reasons why God might allow suffering, but even if I could give you a brilliant explanation, that wouldn't be much good for the parent who has lost their child to bone cancer. But what might help them is to know that they're not alone in a universe where their fate is really on the roll of a dice and suffering is just a brute fact of our existence which has no ultimate answer. I think that for anyone who suffers, the idea that God himself would come in to our winter experience, bear our suffering with us and bring spring, well, that may be the only hope of making sense of any of the suffering that we all do experience in life. And I'd even dare to say that maybe a world in which that love can be expressed is the best kind of world that we can hope for. So, Stephen, I don't believe in your God standing guard at the pearly gates any more than you do. But I do believe in Oscar Wilde's God, a God who expresses himself as a child and who, on a tree, with nail prints in his hands and feet, brings in spring. That's a God worth believing in. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching. For more Thinking Faith, join my newsletter. I'll even send you a free chapter of my latest book when you sign up. The link is with the info. And if you want to support my work, you'll get early access episodes and bonus content too. Gold supporters even get free signed copies of both of my books. Again, the link is below. See you next time.